Today we're going to review the major wars and developments in foreign policy during the 20th century. By the late 1800s, America was still far from being considered a world power. The dominant nations of Earth were in Europe: Britain, France, Russia. These nations were busy conquering lands in Africa and Asia and building new colonial empires. Many politicians in America believed that America needed to also take new lands and territories in order to compete in the new global economy and become a global superpower too. There were many other motives for American imperialism in the late 1800s. First, America wanted to rid North and South America of European influences and colonies. This foreign policy objective was first stated in the Monroe Doctrine in the 1820s and continued throughout the rest of the 19th century. Second, the United States wanted to stimulate its economy by getting new markets for American goods and sources of raw materials. For this reason, the U.S. government purchased or conquered new lands which benefited the U.S. businesses and also provided coaling stations for U.S. ships. Third, many Americans believed in Anglo-Saxon cultural superiority. They believed it was the white man's burden to civilize, Christianize, and democratize the heathen peoples. This philosophy is similar to the belief in social Darwinism that dominated society and politics in the industrial era. Due to these many compelling motives, America slowly expanded her influence beyond the contiguous 48 states. First, the United States bought Alaska from the Russians in 1867, not only to rid North America of Russian influence, but also because of the region's wealth in timber, minerals, and oil. In that same year, the United States took over the uninhabited Midway Islands as a coaling station for trans-Pacific commerce and the Navy. But the real jewel in America's eye was Hawaii, an independent nation ruled by a monarchy. For almost 100 years, Hawaii had been a shipping stop for American boats. In 1887, the United States convinced Hawaii to let them have Pearl Harbor for the American Navy. Many Americans had moved to the island and set up sugar plantations. By the late 1800s, American business investments accounted for about 3/4 of the island's wealth. These American planters profited from low tariffs on sugar imported to the United States. However, in 1890, tariff rates increased, so the American planters overthrew the Queen of Hawaii, Liliuokalani. They set up a republic under businessman Sanford B. Dole, all for the purpose of asking the United States to annex them so the tariff would disappear and profits would increase once again. The president at that time, Grover Cleveland, was an anti-imperialist and refused to annex the new republic. For 6 years, the Republic of Hawaii was its own nation. Until 1897, when President McKinley and Congress approved the annexation. No Hawaiian ever had a chance to vote if they favored annexation or not. Another island that the U.S. was interested in was Cuba, a Spanish colony, located only 90 miles from the shores of Florida. In the 1890s, Cubans, led by José Martí, were in a revolution against Spanish control. The Spanish were particularly brutal as they tried to put down the Cuban Revolution. American newspapers reported and exaggerated these atrocities in the press, a style known as yellow journalism. American outrage, fanned by these sensationalized stories, led to public demands to put an end to Spanish control of Cuba. So, in 1898, the U.S. government sent a ship, the USS Maine, to Cuba under the guises of protecting U.S. property. The Maine mysteriously blew up in the harbor of Havana. While no one knows exactly what caused the explosion, the U.S. press was quick to blame Spain, and American public sentiment pushed U.S. President McKinley to declare war on Spain. The war was very short, and the U.S. easily won. First, the U.S. sent ships to the Philippines, another Spanish colony near China, in order to destroy the Spanish fleet before it could set sail for Cuba. Then, the U.S. Army sent troops to Cuba to expel the Spanish. The U.S. won within a few months and went on to Puerto Rico, a neighboring Spanish colony, to take that island too. At the Treaty of Paris, the Spanish gave Guam and Puerto Rico to the United States as territories, sold the Philippines to the U.S. for $20 million, and freed Cuba. Cuba was not entirely free, however. Before the war, the U.S. Congress had passed the Teller Amendment, which had promised that the U.S. would not annex Cuba. However, after the war was over, the U.S. Congress passed the Platt Amendment. Under the terms of the Platt Amendment, the United States could intervene in Cuban affairs at any time. and the U.S. was given Guantanamo as a military outpost. This meant that Cuba was a protectorate, not quite a U.S. territory, but also not quite free. The people of the Philippines were also not happy with the outcome of the Spanish-American War. Like the Cubans, they had been fighting for independence from Spain for many years under their leader, Emilio Aguinaldo. After they found out that the United States intended on taking them over instead of setting them free, the Filipinos rebelled. For 3 years, the United States fought against the Filipinos to force them to accept U.S. rule. The U.S. eventually won, but it was a brutal and deadly war. The Spanish-American War sparked intense debates in the United States. Many people believed that the U.S. did not need to conquer new territories and become an imperial power, that it wasn't necessary for the economy, and it was hypocritical that the U.S. should take colonies when she herself had once fought for her own freedom from England. Many people spoke out against the war, and especially against the annexation of the Philippines. But the dominant business interests wanted the Philippines, and they got it. The Philippines were seen as a strategic location, not only for a military base, but also as a stepping stone for the markets in China. Many European nations had claimed spheres of influence in China, and now the U.S. was in the region. U.S. businesses wanted a slice of China's pie, too. So, Secretary of State John Hay bullied the European powers into allowing impartial trade in China through the Open Door Notes. This paved the way for massive business investment in Asia. The Spanish-American War was America's most blatant act of imperialism and hasn't been repeated since. However, more subtle forms of control and dominance have continued since the turn of the century. After McKinley was assassinated, Teddy Roosevelt became president and pursued his big stick diplomacy, the nickname given to the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, meaning that the U.S. would now use force to protect its economic interests in Latin America, and to remind European powers to stay out of Latin America. Roosevelt used his big stick in Panama in 1903 when he supported a revolution against Colombia in order to secure control of a canal. Roosevelt's successor, Taft, also supported the corollary through his dollar diplomacy. In the early 1900s, many Latin American nations, such as Nicaragua, had borrowed huge sums of money from European banks that they could not repay. Taft arranged for American bankers to loan Nicaragua money to pay its debts. In exchange, U.S. bankers gained control of Nicaragua's railroads and bank. The next U.S. president, Woodrow Wilson, also exerted his influence in Latin America, but with a different goal. Wilson's style was called missionary or moral diplomacy, which had the objective of promoting democracy in Latin America. This vision was put to the test in Mexico, which was in the throes of revolution. In 1914, Wilson invaded Mexico to expel a dictator. He again invaded in 1917 to chase down Pancho Villa. These actions increased tensions between America and Mexico, but were interrupted by unforeseen events in Europe and the beginning of World War I. As Wilson was worrying over Mexico, Europe had exploded in World War, starting in 1914 with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. As all the nations of Europe became subsumed in the conflict, the United States remained officially neutral for 2 reasons. 1. The U.S. felt no reason to join in a conflict they had nothing to do with. And 2. America had a long history of isolationist sentiment. Despite this, America became more involved in the conflict because U.S. businesses were shipping millions of dollars of war supplies to the Allies, and U.S. banks were loaning millions of dollars to the Allied governments. 2 years into the war, some Americans believed we had to enter the war to ensure that the Allies won so they could repay their debts to the U.S. Others began to question neutrality because German U-boats were threatening U.S. shipping in the Atlantic. In 1917, the British passenger liner the Lusitania was sunk by German U-boats. 128 Americans who were aboard the ship died. At this point, American public opinion really began to turn against Germany, but still, President Wilson could not get public support to declare war. The turning point was the Zimmermann Note, a coded telegram sent from Germany to Mexico in 1917, which was intercepted and revealed a German plot to get Mexico to join the Central Powers and fight against the United States. This outraged the American people. So, in April 1917, the U.S. declared war against Germany. When the U.S. joined with the Allies to fight against Germany in 1917, the war had already dragged on for 3 miserable years. However, the tides were turning. Russia, a key ally, had had a revolution and withdrew from the war on the Eastern Front. This freed up German soldiers to move to the Western Front and to put a final assault on French and British troops in the trenches. However, American soldiers arrived just in time to provide much-needed manpower to defend France. With the help of fresh American troops, the Allies won in the Second Battle of the Marne and began to push the Germans into retreat. By November of 1918, the Germans had agreed to an armistice based on the terms presented by Woodrow Wilson in his 14 points. Wilson sailed to Europe with high hopes of negotiating a lasting peace. But those hopes were quickly dashed once Wilson arrived at the Palace of Versailles for the peace treaty. Contrary to custom, the peace conference did not include the defeated Central Powers or Russia, which was then under control of the Bolsheviks. Instead, the Big Four, US, France, Britain, and Italy, worked out the treaty's details by themselves. Wilson had brought his plan, called the 14 Points, to the conference. The first 5 points were ones that Wilson hoped would prevent another war. 1. No secret treaties. 2. Freedom of the seas. 3. Reduced tariffs to foster free trade. 4. Arms reduction. 5. Help for colonial peoples. The next 8 points dealt with boundary changes based on self-determination. The 14th point called for an international organization to address diplomatic crises like those that had sparked the war. This League of Nations would provide a forum for nations to discuss and settle their grievances without having to resort to war. But Wilson was naive about the political aspects of securing a peace treaty. He failed to grasp the anger felt by the French, the British, and the Italians. Wilson was forced to concede on most of his 14 points in return for the establishment of the League of Nations. The final terms of the Treaty of Versailles were presented in June of 1919. 9 new nations were created and boundaries were shifted. 5 mandates were carved out of the former Ottoman Empire and given to France and Britain as temporary colonies. A League of Nations was created, but the treaty punished Germany harshly by barring it from maintaining an army, making it pay $33 billion in war reparations, and made it accept total guilt for the war. This treatment of Germany weakened the likelihood of a lasting peace in Europe because 1. It humiliated Germany, causing lasting resentment. 2. There was no way Germany could pay the huge financial reparations. 3. Russia lost territory, fueling anger and desire to reconquer its former empire. And 4. The treaty ignored the claims of colonized people for self-determination, stimulating revolutionary movements all over Asia and Africa. So, when Wilson returned to the United States, he faced strong opposition to this flawed treaty. The main opposition centered on the issue of the League of Nations. Conservative senators, headed by Henry Cabot Lodge, believed the League threatened the U.S. foreign policy of isolationism. They believed that only Congress had the right to bring the United States into a war. Wilson refused to compromise, so the Senate did not ratify the treaty. The U.S. signed separate treaties with Germany in 1921 and never joined the League of Nations. World War I traumatized America. Americans retreated back into isolationism, even though at the same time the war made the U.S. into one of the world's greatest powers. In Europe, the economic destruction and massive loss of life of World War I severely damaged social and political systems. In many countries, the war created political instability and violence that persisted for decades. During these unstable times, Stalin centralized control over the Soviet Union, and militant fascist organizations seized control in Italy, Spain, and Germany. And ultra-nationalistic and militaristic Japan began to seize lands in northern China. Mussolini took Ethiopia and Albania, and Hitler slowly began violating the terms of the Treaty of Versailles by rebuilding his army and annexing neighboring countries. The Great Depression in the United States sparked a global depression and dissuaded many nations from confronting the aggression of the Axis powers of Italy, Germany, and Japan. Britain and France appeased Hitler and Mussolini, while Americans clung to isolationism in the 1930s. In 1935, the U.S. Congress passed the first Neutrality Act, which outlawed arms of sales or loans to nations at war or in civil war. This was an effort to keep the U.S. out of the looming conflict in Europe and Asia. However, once Hitler invaded Poland and World War II began, U.S. neutrality slowly began to break down. In 1939, Roosevelt persuaded Congress to pass a cash and carry provision that allowed warring nations to buy U.S. arms as long as they paid cash and transported them in their own ships. Roosevelt also persuaded Congress to pass the Selective Service Act, which drafted 16 million men into the Army, even though the U.S. wasn't technically at war. After Roosevelt was re-elected to his third term, he secured the Lend-Lease Act from Congress in 1941. The Lend-Lease Act allowed the U.S. to lend or lease arms and other supplies to any country whose defense was vital to the United States. This opened the floodgates to massive production and transportation of arms over the Atlantic to Great Britain and the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, German wolf packs prowled the ocean, sinking American ships. By late 1941, Roosevelt authorized U.S. ships to shoot German submarines on sight. In the Pacific, tension was growing between the Empire of Japan and the United States. To punish Japan for conquering more territories in Asia, the U.S. cut off trade with Japan and embargoed goods Japan could not live without, such as oil. While outwardly gesturing towards peace by sending delegates to the United States, secretly the Japanese military prepared for an attack on the United States. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The very next day, the United States declared war on Japan. 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. Churchill and Roosevelt decided that the first priority was to defeat Hitler and liberate Europe. The U.S. Army was fortunately much more prepared in 1941 than it had been in 1917 at the beginning of World War I. U.S. troops were first deployed to North Africa, where they helped the British expel the Nazis from Tunisia. Then the U.S. troops went to Italy, where they first defeated the fascists and then fought against the Germans from the underbelly of Europe. When Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt all met for the first time at the Yalta Conference, Stalin put pressure on Britain and the United States to open a second front against the Germans in France. Plans began for an invasion, codenamed D-Day, for June 6, 1944. The invasion of the Normandy coast and the D-Day invasion was costly, but successful, and a pivotal turning point of the war. Germany was now on the defensive in both the eastern and western fronts. After the last German offensive at the Battle of the Bulge, the Germans finally surrendered and the war in Europe was over on May 8, 1945. However, the war was not over in the Pacific. By 1944, the Japanese were on the defensive after the turning point battle of Midway in 1942. President Roosevelt had died, and now his Vice President Truman was in charge. The Americans were island hopping their way towards Japan and were planning a land invasion. But the battles to secure Iwo Jima and Okinawa were so costly in American lives that the United States began to question the feasibility of a land invasion of Japan. Instead, Truman authorized the dropping of 2 atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This successfully forced the Japanese military to accept unconditional surrender. The war was finally over in August 1945. But actually, a new war was starting, the Cold War. At the Potsdam Conference in July of 1945, Truman, Stalin, and Churchill met and defeated Germany to make plans for post-war Europe. The meeting was full of tension. First, the former Allies clashed over Germany. In the end, they decided to divide Germany into occupation zones, as well as divide up the city of Berlin. These divisions came to have lasting meaning for the Cold War. Second, the former Allies clashed over Eastern Europe. Stalin had previously promised free elections in the nations occupied by the Red Army, but at Potsdam, he backed out of the promise and instead turned the Eastern Bloc into a buffer zone, his satellite states. The division between the Soviet-controlled satellite states and the Western European states came to be called the Iron Curtain. Despite the creation of a new international organization, the United Nations, designed to prevent future wars, tension between the Soviet Union and the United States continued to grow in the years after World War II ended. These two countries were the dominant superpowers, economically and militarily, but they couldn't find common ground in their conflicting ideologies: communism versus capitalism. Truman, who was the president in the early years of the Cold War, first put forth the policy of containment in his Truman Doctrine of 1946, which pledged aid to Turkey and Greece to stop the spread of communism in those nations. Truman also signed into law the Marshall Plan of 1947, which gave aid to Western Europe to support their economies and governments. Truman had to deal with the first major Cold War confrontation, when Stalin blockaded West Berlin. Truman organized the Berlin Airlift in 1948 to prevent the fall of this city to Soviet control. In 1949, Truman formed a new Cold War alliance called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. All of these events proved Truman's resolve to follow the policy of containment. However, by the end of his first full term as president, Americans were afraid they were losing the Cold War and blamed Truman for two major reasons. First, in 1949, Mao Zedong won the decades-long civil war in China and transformed the huge nation into a communist regime. And second, in 1950, the Korean War began, when North Korea invaded South Korea. By the election of 1952, the war was a stalemate at the 38th parallel. So, in 1952, Americans voted for a change, and they chose the famous general and Republican Eisenhower. Eisenhower immediately negotiated an armistice in the Korean War, ending that conflict. But Eisenhower's other Cold War policies escalated tensions throughout the 1950s with his brinkmanship policies, the Eisenhower Doctrine, which extended containment to the Middle East, increased spending on the arms race and the space race, covert actions in Guatemala and Iran, and aid to France and Vietnam to fight off Ho Chi Minh and his Viet Minh. Then, the U-2 incident in 1960 brought tensions to an all-time high. In 1960, John F. Kennedy was elected amid turmoil about what to do about the Cuban Revolution that had happened a year earlier, bringing Fidel Castro to power. Eisenhower's administration and the CIA had planned a secret operation called the Bay of Pigs to attempt to overthrow Castro. The plan was implemented in the first months of Kennedy's presidency, but was an utter failure. Because of the U-2 incident and the Bay of Pigs, the Soviet premier, Khrushchev, decided to place nuclear missiles on Cuba. But when American spy planes discovered them, the Cuban Missile Crisis began. 13 days of fear that gripped the nation. In the end, the standoff ended through a combination of brinkmanship, setting up a naval quarantine, and diplomacy, negotiations between Kennedy and Khrushchev, a strategy that Kennedy called flexible response. The resulting compromise was that the Soviet Union would remove its missiles from Cuba if the U.S. removed its missiles from Turkey and promised to never again invade Cuba. Kennedy had two other Cold War issues to negotiate. One, the building of the Berlin Wall, which he decided to ignore to avoid more conflict. And two, Vietnam. In the early 60s, the U.S. was supporting the regime of Ngo Dinh Diem in South Vietnam, an autocratic and unpopular president. After Diem was assassinated, the U.S. continued to provide military aid, military advisors, and diplomatic support for the succession of military dictators in South Vietnam. But Kennedy was beginning to question the involvement of the U.S. in the region. But when Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, the Vietnam conflict fell into the hands of Lyndon B. Johnson, who fully embraced domino theory and believed the U.S. had to support South Vietnam no matter what. After the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, Johnson secured a congressional resolution authorizing him to use whatever force necessary in Vietnam. This was when the draft began, when U.S. troops first set foot in Vietnam, and their numbers escalated to over 500,000 by 1968. Despite America's overwhelming military superiority in Vietnam, U.S. tactics were not effective against the resolve of the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong. The most famous turning point of the Vietnam War was the 1968 Tet Offensive, when the Viet Cong simultaneously attacked many South Vietnamese cities that the Americans thought were safely in their control. Even though U.S. forces put down the Tet Offensive, it caused U.S. troops to lose morale and the American public to question the purpose of the war. The Tet Offensive and the failure of the Vietnam War in general devoured Johnson's presidency. In 1968, Johnson declined to run for a second term. Republican Cold Warrior Nixon handily won this election with his motto, "Peace with Honor." Nixon had two faces in the Vietnam War. Nixon's public face was that of de-escalation, the Vietnamization policy, and the pledge to end the war in Vietnam. Nixon did eventually negotiate the end of the Vietnam War in 1973. But Nixon's other secret face actually involved escalation of the conflict, increased bombing of North Vietnam, and carpet bombing of Cambodia in order to pressure the North Vietnamese to negotiate. The revelation of these secret bombing missions outraged the American public, one of many fatal decisions that ultimately led to the resignation of Nixon in 1974. It was Vice President Ford who was in the White House when, in 1975, the North Vietnamese invaded the South and took over Saigon, reuniting the nation under one communist regime. The refusal of Congress to come to the aid of South Vietnam in 1975 signaled a dramatic change in American Cold War policy. But the Cold War was still more than a decade from ending. Withdrawing troops from Vietnam was just one example of Nixon's détente policies, the practice of lessening tensions with the Soviets. Nixon also visited China to meet Mao Zedong in 1973. He also signed the SALT I treaty with Brezhnev. Tensions did decrease in the early 70s. But the tensions increased yet again under President Carter, who had to deal with many crises in the Middle East. On a positive note, President Carter successfully negotiated an agreement between Egypt and Israel at the Camp David Accords in 1978. But Carter could not negotiate the release of the 52 Americans who were taken hostage in Iran after the overthrow of the Shah. And then in 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. In 1980, Americans were once again afraid about the faltering economy and afraid that the U.S. was losing the Cold War. So Americans, once again, voted for change and picked the hard-talking Ronald Reagan, who vowed to defeat the Soviet Union. Reagan greatly increased defense spending on weapons and the Strategic Defense Initiative, also known as Star Wars, challenging the Soviets to a new arms race. Reagan also continued covert wars in Latin America, El Salvador, Nicaragua, in the name of containing the spread of communism. By 1987, when Reagan visited Berlin and challenged the Soviets to tear down the Berlin Wall, the Soviet Union was in economic crisis. Its command-style economy simply could not keep up with American capitalist system. The premier at the time, Gorbachev, instituted social, political, and economic reforms known as glasnost and perestroika. But the reforms were unable to stop the inevitable crumbling of the Soviet system of control. In 1989, the Berlin Wall was torn down, and Germany was reunited. By 1991, the Soviet satellite states had all declared themselves independent, and the Soviet Union collapsed. The Cold War was finally over. In the decades after the Cold War ended, the United States has been considered the dominant superpower. But this hasn't stopped wars from occurring. Most of the modern foreign policy challenges flow out of conflicts in the Middle East over access to oil, religion, nuclear weapons, and Israel. The Persian Gulf War, also known as the First Iraq War, successfully achieved its goal of removing Saddam Hussein from Kuwait, but did not resolve the lingering issue of Iraq's nuclear weapons program. This led up to the invasion of Iraq in 2003, which is a conflict we are still dealing with. Currently, America is also dealing with terrorist groups in Afghanistan, a war which started with the 9/11 attacks in 2001. The US is also having to deal with the nuclear ambitions of Iran and the rise of a militarily and economically powerful China. Whoever becomes our next president will have many challenges on his hands.